Across Africa, women play central roles in sustaining households and communities. Yet, when it comes to civic and political engagement, activities such as attending public meetings, contacting leaders, and participating in decision-making, women's voices often remain underrepresented. Consider a rural council area outside Mashuru in the Kingdom of Lesotho. A group of women gather early in the morning before the demands of the day take over. They meet not as a formal organization, but as neighbors who share responsibilities for fetching water, managing household finances, and caring for children and elderly relatives. Today, they are preparing to approach their local councillor about persistent water shortages. One woman explains that the community meetings where these issues are discussed typically take place in the evening, a time when she is preparing food or managing childcare. Another mentions that when she has attended, discussions were dominated by men who were more comfortable speaking publicly and who often had access to more information beforehand. Their concerns are clear and evidence-based. Their capacity to contribute is strong, but their ability to participate fully is constrained by factors that have little to do with motivation and everything to do with the practical realities of their lives. In Lagos, Nigeria, a group of women preparing for a community forum describe similar experiences. They have spent weeks gathering data from market traders, reviewing local safety concerns, and organizing the logistics for the event. Yet, several of them express uncertainty about whether they will be given equal speaking time or whether their concerns will be dismissed as secondary to larger political issues. One woman notes that although she frequently engages in community work, she rarely speaks at town hall meetings because they are not designed with women's time, safety, or responsibilities in mind. These are not isolated stories. They reflect broader regional patterns documented in Afrobarometer's data. Women are engaged in civic life, but structural, cultural, and logistical barriers continue to suppress their visible participation in formal public spaces.
Welcome to Voices Africa, a podcast from Afrobarometer. I'm your host, Shannon Van Veek Kosa. The experiences we've just heard reflect a consistent pattern across the continent. Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report shows that women participate at lower rates than men in nearly every measured form of civic and political engagement, from attending community meetings to contacting elected officials, joining civic groups, and taking part in protests. These gaps are not the result of lower interest or capability. Instead, they stem from structural and social factors that shape women's daily realities, these being the unequal distribution of unpaid care work, limited discretionary time, safety concerns in public and political spaces, cultural norms that discourage women's public leadership, unequal access to political information and digital tools, and institutional processes that are not designed with women's participation in mind. At the same time, evidence also shows that when women are able to participate, Their involvement strengthens local decision-making, improves accountability, and broadens the range of issues addressed by leaders. In today's episode, we examine why these gender gaps persist, how they differ across contexts, and what kinds of interventions have been shown to increase women's participation in meaningful and measurable ways. Before we dive deeper, a quick note about who we are and where these insights come from. Afrobarometer is a pan-African research network that has, for more than 2 decades, worked to amplify the voices of ordinary Africans. Through nationally representative surveys across about 40 African countries, Afrobarometer collects reliable data on citizens' thoughts, experiences, and preferences on a wide range of issues that affect their lives. We share our findings in publications, reports, news releases, and social media posts so that people's voices can become part of evidence-based policy and decision-making. Our 2025 flagship report, which informs this podcast series, focuses on how people participate in democracy. It captures the full spectrum of participation, from voting and contacting leaders to community meetings, protests, and online activism.
In Botswana, a market trader and community volunteer explains why she avoided public meetings for years. This experience reflects a common pattern. Meeting schedules and formats often align with men's availability, not women's. When meetings in her district were shifted to earlier time slots, women's attendance increased substantially. In northern Ghana, a women's advocacy group began monitoring school infrastructure. They found that the lack of adequate sanitation facilities disproportionately affected girls' attendance. The group gathered evidence, convened discussions with district officials, and pushed for budget reallocation. Within months, new sanitation blocks were installed. This case illustrates how women's participation often brings specific community issues to the forefront, issues that may otherwise be overlooked.
To unpack these findings further, I spoke with Amina Oyagbola, a gender inclusion specialist and Afrobarometer's board chair. Amina Oyagbola is an independent director and business management consultant with over 35 years of experience across legal practice and corporate management in Nigeria. She has held executive roles, including as a human resources and corporate services executive at MTN Nigeria, and her expertise spans human resources strategy, legal consulting, banking, finance, oil and gas, and telecommunications. Amina is the managing consultant of AKMS Consulting, a senior partner at Oyagbola Chambers, and a Chevening Scholar. She is also deeply committed to leadership and gender empowerment. She is the founder and chairperson of Women in Successful Careers, also known as WISCA, a mentoring and leadership initiative for professional women, a fellow and former chair of the Africa Leadership Initiative of West Africa, and a fellow of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. In 2023, she was appointed to Nigeria's Presidential Council on Support to Women and Girls, one of many recognitions of her contributions to gender equality and women's empowerment. Amina, thank you so much for joining us on the Voices Africa podcast. Afrobarometer data shows persistent gender gaps in participation. What drives these disparities?
Thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this wonderful platform. Well, what the Afrobarometer data shows very clearly is this, that gender gaps is not really about a lack of interest by women. It is about the unequal cost of participation. If you look across many African countries, women participate less than men in voting, in attending community meetings, in contacting their leaders, members of their parliament, and in collective action. And this is not because women are disengaged or lack interest in governance or in politics. It is simply because participation is more expensive and it is more risky for them and they lack access. So the thing is that women carry a disproportionate unpaid care responsibility. The data actually shows that women carry 4 times, more of the unpaid care responsibilities than men. And they often have fewer financial resources due to marginalization over time, less mobility because of their family responsibilities, less institutional access because of the old boys club, and greater safety concerns, especially in the political and civic arena. The Afrobarometer data is very useful because it shows that many Africans actually believe that women who run for office face harassment and intimidation. And that perception alone is a very powerful deterrent and can discourage women from participating in civic and political activities. Finally, there is also the legitimacy issue. In many environments and contexts within Africa, women are still socialized to be submissive, to defer, to be cautious in public spaces, and to see politics as a purely male territory. We also see this dynamic very clearly in leadership pipelines. In Nigeria and across much of Africa, women are well represented, you'll find, in corporate arena, at entry level and at early career levels across sectors. However, as their careers progress towards senior leadership or mid-career level and executive management and board-level decision-making, their numbers begin to decline very sharply. And the number of women entering the workforce simply does not match the number of women represented in leadership, where power and influence and decisions are exercised. So to summarize this issue, I think what I'd like to say is that the gap persists not because women lack competence or commitment or a willingness to lead. The ability is clearly there and the willingness is there, but because systems were not designed with women's lived realities in mind, and the Afrobarometer data shows that clearly.
Thank you, Amina. You've started touching on what I was going to ask in my next question, and you specifically focused on the cultural context here. But I think I'd like to understand, how do education, that combination of the cultural context and then also access to information, intersect with gender participation, particularly in today's digital age?
Thank you, Shannon. Education is so, so important. I mean, as Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon, to transform or change the world. So education clearly increases confidence and awareness. And educated women are more likely to discuss politics and understand their rights and be more engaged. But you see, that's why data is so important. The Afrobarometer data shows very clearly that education alone is not enough. In deeply patriarchal contexts, and that is the case in many African countries on the continent, even educated women face resistance. And in some cases, the awareness of the risks or the inefficiencies in the systems and in the structures can discourage participation. And we've seen this, and I have experienced it myself personally. So access to information also matters. If women have less access to media, to digital tools, like we're now in the AI revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, and if care is not taken, women will be further marginalized unless the systems and the inputs are mainstreamed to reflect women's perspective. So access even to civic information, meaningful engagements become harder. And when institutions are not responsive, information without influence leads to further disengagement. So I think, to summarize what I'm trying to say, participation rises most where 3 things move together. So education, secondly, supportive cultural norms, which we touched on earlier, and responsive institutions.
And in your work, both as Afrobarometer's board chair and with your organization, Women in Successful Careers, which countries are seeing the fastest progress toward gender parity and participation, and what do you attribute this to?
The Afrobarometer data and the Insight Report is so useful because it shows that in countries such as South Africa, Botswana, and Seychelles, gender gaps across several forms of participation are smaller. In some activities, women's participation approaches that of men, particularly in voting and collective action. But in certain countries like, Rwanda, Namibia, Senegal, the statistics in terms of female participation are a lot higher. What explains this? That's the question that we should all be asking ourselves. Why? The reality and the answer is that, context clearly matters. If you look at, all these countries, and if you look at the data in detail, the Afrobarometer data, you will see that where legal protections are clearer, where women's leadership is visible, and where public engagement is socially accepted, the cost of participation, the psychological and the structural barriers are a lot lower. And therefore, women can participate. So for me, the lesson is simple. Progress in terms of closing gender gaps, in terms of gender parity, does not happen by accident. We have to be intentional about it. It happens where there is the political will, there are supportive institutions with the right processes and structures, and where there is strong civic movements. So when systems intentionally reduce the barriers and the constraints that women face, women participate more. That's what the data shows. And the countries that are advancing, that is what you will see. The countries that are lagging behind, including my own country, Nigeria, where we have all the legal frameworks and have signed up to all the international protocols. Yet, in a country with over 230 million people, at the National Assembly, the number of women who are politically active is under 5%, which is extremely dismal.
Amina, you've spoken about the importance of women's participation at every level of governance. I'm curious to see if there is any specific grassroots movement or organization being led by women currently that you believe is transforming governance in any country in Africa right now.
Yes, thank you so much again, Shannon, for that question. I think that one very powerful insight from the Afrobarometer data is that poorer women often participate actively at community level. I think that's a very, very powerful insight. So what that means is that women experiencing high-lived poverty are frequently present in community meetings, contacting the traditional leaders and mobilizing around local issues a lot more than the elite. And then across Africa, you find that women organize around basic things like water access, health services, education, land rights, and market reforms, which affect their families. These kinds of movements and actions do not always carry formal titles, but they shape and transform governance outcomes, and they are really, really important. We also see on the continent youth-led movements and protests where young women increasingly claim public voice despite the systemic barriers. And it's almost like things have to get to a head where, the women rise up because they're very, very upset. And then they carry their placards and hit the streets. And, even for Nigeria, the famous Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who led the protest over taxes that were imposed, with female traders, and that led to a whole spin-off of activities. So these are fundamental, I think, to democratic accountability. But then beyond those grassroots movements, there are also organizations, civil society organizations that are performing a very, very critical role in terms of trying to keep governments accountable, trying to ensure advocacy and the push and the call to action in certain directions. And, I'll use my own country as an example. In Nigeria, even the whole issue of trying to advocate for the gender bills, which did not pass in 2025, and which has now been modified into what they call the Reserve Seats Bill, which had not been successfully pushed through the National Assembly. We have organizations like my NGO, WISCA. We're now actually part of a coalition of female organizations and the Nigerian Governors Forum. So there's a coalition of WISCA, WIMBIS, WILAN, and the Nigerian Governors Forum. The Nigerian Governors Forum is a forum that is represented by all the governors in the 36 states of Nigeria. And we're advocating for change, pushing for change. In this particular case, we're advocating for a minimum of 35% female representation in the private sector and in the public sector. We're also advocating for labor reforms around maternity and paternity leave, which center around this whole issue of, the unpaid care work, which, women are predominantly burdened with. These things affect, women's ability to engage fully in the workplace and also to accelerate their advancement up the ladder. At Whisker, which is Women in Successful Careers, we engage in mentorship, structured mentorship, and also focusing on leadership development and capacity building, which help to move women from corporate roles into also public leadership roles on boards, commissions, and reform committees. These are also governance transformation issues. There was the youth movement that you may be aware of also here in Nigeria, and of course also in Kenya, where young Africans rose up against and protested against certain issues that they felt were unjust by their various governments. So these are very, very important. And I believe that these incidents, when they occur, help to transform governance, because what it does is that it calls the governments to account. It brings visibility to issues that matter to the people, essentially the voice of the citizen, which is what Afrobarometer is all about, is amplified. And even if you don't get all your demands and all it is that you're advocating for, it creates a certain kind of awareness that leads to systemic change over time. The reality is that change does not only come from Parliament, it comes from organized, informed, and confident women influencing decisions at every level. Inclusive leaders understand this. The role of these organizations helps to correct the imbalance that exists in the system.
You've given us tangible examples of what inclusive leadership practices look like. I think my next question to you is, what is the role of male allyship within these institutions in order to close the participation gap?
Okay, thanks very much, Anna, for that question. The first thing I think I want to say here is that gender equality is not a women's issue. We need to move away from that. The research and the data is very, very clear. It is a governance issue. It makes smart business sense. It is smart economics. Male allies can do a lot to change the landscape. You know, they can sponsor women into leadership roles. They can insist on inclusive panels and boards. They can nominate or appoint women for high-stakes assignments and challenge exclusionary behavior that they observe. And they need to do this not quietly, but publicly, so that there's a contagion effect and behaviors and cultures begin to change. The truth is that institutions have to move beyond the rhetoric and the talk. Gender targets, accountability, safe reporting systems, and transparent selection processes matter. Organizations that are led by whether men or women must intentionally redesign their systems. The architecture that exists and that has been historically in place needs to change fundamentally. We need to build a new house. So the recruitment processes, the promotion pathways, the board appointments, and the policy consultations, need to change so that women are not treated as exceptions, but as expected contributors to leadership and governance. Gender desks exist, like for instance, in my country, gender desks exist in every ministry, department, and agency of government. But are they well funded? Do they have budgets? I mean, gender desks without budgets and the allocation of resources, they change nothing, because you can't do anything. Without a monitoring and evaluation mechanism, how do you implement? How do you drive change? How do you track progress? It requires men and institutions to move from the talk and the rhetoric and passive support to being actively responsible leaders of reform and the change that we want to see. So to sort of round up, I think participation gaps only close when leadership becomes intentional about sharing power and when women's voices become mainstream and embedded in how governance works. This approach, essentially, that I am articulating, treats women's leadership as a public good, not as a women's issue, as a public good that benefits all stakeholders, essentially everyone, male and female. When leadership development is rooted in integrity, is rooted in service and in responsibility beyond self, the impact extends beyond individual advancement to stronger institutions, to better governance, to a good society, and for the betterment of all. So when inclusion becomes systemic, which is what we're talking about, institutions become stronger, more legitimate, and more sustainable. And that's where I'm hoping that we will see ourselves, on the African continent in the future, in the years ahead. I would like to see certain shifts, major changes on the African continent. I'd just like to close by saying that I believe that Africa's democracy cannot reach its full potential while half of its citizens remain underrepresented. Gender equality is not a favor to women. I repeat, gender equality is not a favor to women. It is a strategic investment in better governance, a strategic investment in better development. It is a strategic investment in our collective and shared prosperity. And it is a strategic investment in the aspirations of our people on the African continent. I'm very, very passionate about this. It is also, an issue of equity. It's an issue of justice and equal rights for every human being. So it really should not matter whether you are male or female. The only consideration should be, because we are biologically different and women have a huge responsibility in terms of procreation. So the necessary infrastructure needs to be put in place for women to be able to meet those family and civic responsibilities and duties, whilst ensuring that they're still able and enabled to be able to contribute effectively to the family's prosperity, the community's prosperity, and the prosperity of the larger society in terms of their economic inclusion and participation.
Women's participation in civic and political life remains uneven, not because women lack interest or capacity, but because the environment around them is less enabling. The evidence shows that when barriers are removed, whether logistical, cultural, or institutional, women participate at levels equal to or higher than men. Improving inclusion requires structural adjustments, such as shifting meeting times, designing safer public spaces, increasing access to political information, supporting women's groups and leadership pipelines, and encouraging men to share domestic responsibilities. Ultimately, strengthening women's participation strengthens democracy. It broadens the range of issues that receive attention and increases accountability at all levels. Closing the gender gap is not only a matter of fairness, it's also a matter of effectiveness. I'm Shannon van Kosa, and this is Voices Africa, a podcast from Afrobarometer. Join us next time as we explore the connection between democratic equality, trust, and participation, and why citizens are more engaged when they believe their governments are responsive. To read Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report on citizen engagement, visit afrobarometer.org.